Have you ever been present at a moment in time where two twins reared apart first met each other?
Yes, several
What
times.
happened? What happened?
Well, it's remarkable.
Studies of identical twins have provided great insights into the human condition, particularly in terms of the relative influences of genes and the environment on how people look and act and what their competencies are. So how similar are identical twins? How similar are twins brought up together versus brought up apart? How much more similar are they than fraternal twins? And how do the experiences of twins towards each other differ to those experiences of regular siblings? Do twins have special bonds? And what happens to those bonds if they're broken? Here to discuss with me the mysteries and wonders of twins is world-renowned twin expert, Professor Nancy Segal. Nancy, welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Nancy, I think I know the answer you're going to give to this first question, but I shall ask it anyway, and I'm sure you can add to it. Well, would you say that the closest human bond possible is between identical twins?
Yes, I would agree with that. And I'm basing that on the fact that in the vast majority of research articles and research studies, identical twins come out the closest, over and beyond ordinary siblings, over and beyond fraternal twins, over and beyond parent-child relationships. And I can tell you that from studies based on experimental games, interviews, loss of a twin. And this cuts across sex, it cuts across country, it cuts across age group. So it's a very robust finding.
Why would it be that identical twins have the strongest bond of all human bond pairings?
Well, I believe it's because they perceive similarities in themselves. You know, it's not just the physical resemblance, because I have a study on unrelated lookalikes, and while they meet for the first time and expect a close relationship, most of them don't find it. So I believe it's the perceptions of behavioral similarities. We see this in twins raised together, but also, most strikingly, in twins raised apart who have not known each other for very long and yet forge enormously close bonds. Now, I think you can also look at this at an evolutionary psychological level, where we are predisposed, according to Hamilton's theory of kin selection, we're predisposed to be more altruistic and cooperative towards those individuals with whom we share higher proportions of genes in common. And no two people share higher proportions than identical twins, which is 100%. Now, you don't go around in your social circles calculating genetic relatedness, but as Dawkins said, you behave as if you do. And so I believe it's no secret that identical twins are predisposed to act in kind toward their identical twin. It's a way of assuring getting their own genes out into subsequent generations.
And let's just pull back a second here. So that's a super interesting opening. But just for people who are less clear about the biology of twins, in fact, there are, well, in simple terms, two types of twins. Nancy, could you briefly explain that for us?
Sure. So there are two types, one being the identical twins, who result when a single fertilized egg or zygote divides between the 1st and 14th post-conceptional day. These twins are both male or both female, and they share all their genes in common. Now, there can be point mutations, there can be some developmental glitches, but for all practical purposes, they share 100% of their genes. The other type of twin is the fraternal twins, and they result when a woman releases two eggs at the same time, and they're separately fertilized by sperm from the father. So they share half the genes on average by descent, and this is the same genetic relationship as ordinary siblings. These fraternal twins can either be two males, two females, or one male and one female. And according to the natural twinning rate, identical twins represent 1/3 of the twin populations, with fraternal twins being 2/3. But of course, IVF and other reproductive technologies have played havoc with those numbers. And we see many more fraternal twins being born than in the past. Although I think something many people don't realize is that IVF, in vitro fertilization, also has a slight increase on identical twinning because micromanipulation in the laboratory sometimes amplifies the possibility of zygotic splitting.
Oh, that's interesting. So IVF is bringing into play more twins and more identical twins than
It,
we would have had previously.
yes, but the dramatic increase is mostly in the fraternal twins. And another reason why we're seeing a rise in fraternal twinning is that mothers are delaying the childbearing years to complete an education, to secure financial resources, to have jobs. And so older mothers have a higher chance of releasing two eggs at the same time. You could think of it as a reproductive error because the human body is structured to accommodate one baby at a time. And it could be in evolutionary terms that the idea of two babies being born at the same time is kind of a genetic insurance because also with older mothers, you have a higher risk of some genetic defect, particularly Down syndrome. So it's kind of hedging your genetic bets, although obviously you're not doing this consciously. But the idea that you might conceive two children at the same time might be a good way of getting your genes into future populations.
Pragmatically, for mothers that would like to have more than one child, to have two in one go is kind of playing catch up with time, isn't it?
It certainly is. And, many people think that having twins is a real parental burden. I tell them it isn't. Perhaps in the beginning, you've got two babies, and often you've gone from no children to two or one child to three. But after you get through the very beginning, then the twins entertain each other. And they actually act as each other's babysitters and free parents to a great extent. And you're done with diapers at the same time in comparison with having children close in time, which I think is probably a more difficult situation. Here, the children are chronologically and pretty much intellectually and temperamentally age matched. So I think it's really an easier situation in the long run. And plus, I will say that mothers enjoy the special status of being a mother of multiples. It's something that still turns heads.
And fathers. But
And
yes, absolutely, it does. Everyone loves twins, doesn't it? Everyone's inherently interested in twins.
no question about that, Lewis. There is a universal interest and fascination with twins. And I've often thought a lot about why that's the case. And I've decided that it's because we all are raised to expect individual differences in behavior and appearance. So when we encounter identical twins who look and act so much alike, it challenges our idea and the way that the world should work. And we're so fascinated and drawn by their amazing similarities and the fact that they can both break world records if they're athletes. So even for people who perhaps shy away from that kind of closeness that identical twins convey, they're still intrigued.
I agree. I agree with you. I think there might be another reason as well, which is, and it sounds slightly odd, but it's that you've kind of got the same person twice. Now, obviously, you don't. They're two completely separate people with their own consciousness and so on and so forth. But you kind of think, well, this has happened twice. The same genes has happened twice, but there's two people. And I just think that's interesting to mull over and something intriguing for people to consider when they confront it.
Well, yes, I would agree with that too. There's certainly that element. But as you say, they are two completely separate people with independent thoughts. Often their thoughts coincide because they respond to the world the same way. We have lots of intelligence and information processing studies to show that twins do tackle problems and items in similar fashion. But nevertheless, they're individual people. And the funny thing is, I find this strange contradiction that people sometimes do regard them as copies of the same person, but many parents of identical twins and many people who know identical twins emphasize the differences and say they're nothing alike. Now, I think that people have to make conscious efforts to distinguish between them. We need to know who's who, and I think maybe that dates back to evolutionary history where we had to know our friends from our foes. So we do want to be able to distinguish between people. But Nevertheless, when you look at the research, you find that identical twins invariably come out more alike in intelligence, personality, values, temperament than do fraternal twins or any other kinship.
No, absolutely. Okay, so I want to move on to that, but I'm actually intrigued. I want to come back onto one thing you said earlier, Nancy, about the rearing of twins and how actually there are some advantages to it because you get the two together and they kind of look after each other. One thing I've noticed with mothers and fathers who have two children kind of in series, so one and then another one a couple of years, 3, 4 years later, is that they can be quite caught out by the second one being so different to the first. They have an experience of bringing up a child, their child, certain toys, certain bedtime routines, certain behaviors. And I think often parents can be caught out by how different a second child can behave.
Yes, that is absolutely the case. And in fact, I often say that parents of one child are environmentalists and parents of two are geneticists, because the parents of the second child realize how different that child often is from the first. And we tend to think of our home environments as being exactly the same for two children in a family, but in point of fact, they're not, because we all gravitate towards the events and the objects and the resources that interest us. So one child in a family may be drawn to the family's computer. The other child may like the sports equipment. So those are very different environments that we all craft. Now, I was in an interesting debate about 4 years ago now in New York City. It's called the IQ Squared debates that are held in New York City. And I was supporting uh, the idea that parenting is overrated. And actually, I did not like that title. I would have preferred it to be parenting is misunderstood, because I made the point that parenting is a very important and serious undertaking that I regarded as parents' critical responsibility to stay attuned to their children, to know what makes them happy, to know what they're good at, to try to nurture them, to try to make them the best that they can be. But I think we're caught in this cycle of overparenting where before the baby's even born, they're enrolled in special classes and we're buying all these CDs that don't mean a thing. And so I think if parents just relax and do what parents in the past always did, your children will come out and just be okay. So I think that parenting is a misunderstood concept. Not that it's not unimportant. I think it's very important.
No, absolutely, and I'd like to come back to that a bit later on, actually, and maybe finish with a part about parenting and perhaps what twin studies and so forth can tell us about parenting. Just one more thing on fraternal twins. So parents can find that one child is very different to their subsequent child that they bring up. Of course, with fraternal twins, you have they are no more similar than regular brothers and sisters. They're born at more or less the same time. They develop at the same time in the womb. Um, I know you have personal experience of this, very direct experience. Are fraternal twins any more similar than regular siblings, or are they kind of the same deal but just pop out at the same time?
Well, fraternal twins and ordinary siblings share the same degree of genetic relatedness, as we said, half their genes on average by descent. But in some ways, fraternal twins are more alike. We find that the IQ similarity is slightly higher, and that's probably because they do come into the family at the same time. They go to school at the same time when certain subjects are emphasized or certain ways of teaching are things that are in vogue at the time. So they're somewhat more alike. But in general, there's not that much difference. I mean, children who are the same age are going to be more alike in certain ways than children who are separated by several years. So I think that that's a fairly common finding.
Oh yes, that's a good point. It's interesting that IQ is perhaps a little bit more closely correlated between fraternal twins than regular siblings, because that would suggest that there is some environmental influence on IQ.
Well, there certainly is an environmental influence in IQ. No one ever says that it's completely genetic. Now, we know from many, many studies that the genetic component to intelligence, general intelligence, is about 75%. What that means is misunderstood, and I'll try to explain that to your listeners or your viewers, is that It does not refer to the fact that if I took a person, I could slice their intelligence into a genetic and environmental component, a 75-25% split. What it means is that if I were to measure general intelligence in a population of people, there'd be variations from person to person. And about 75% of those individual differences would be linked to the genetic differences among the people, with 25% being linked to environmental factors.
That's very important to have explained, actually. Yeah, because it can often be misunderstood, as you say, the genetic component. Let's dig in a little bit to thinking about twins in terms of studies. So twins are relatively rare, but not super duper rare. And so overall, there's a good number of twins around. And over the years, it's been possible through various means, shall we say, to gain access to twins and to study them. So, generally speaking, to study how much twins or how similar or how different they are to each other, again, compared to regular siblings, and also how similar or different they are, depending on whether they're brought up together or whether they're brought up apart. Nancy, would you be so kind just to sort of start from the beginning, the fundamentals of twin studies and twin adoption studies, and how and why, though, they are so insightful?
Yeah. Well, the twin method, the classic method, is a very simple and elegant approach to understanding genetic and environmental influences on behavior. You simply compare a trait, let's say height, using a number of identical twins. How alike are they? Compare that to fraternal twins. Identical twins will be more alike in height. Many studies show that. So you can conclude that there is a genetic influence on that particular trait. But there are variations on this classic method. You can look at identical twins and fraternal twins raised apart from birth. With identical twins raised apart, any similarity between them has to be genetic, giving you a pure estimate of genetic influence because they live in completely separate environments. And the fraternal twins raised apart provide a good comparison to that. You can also look at identical twins in a way that's called co-twin control. And this is a very interesting method. Identical twins sometimes differ. You can look at it experimentally or naturally. Let's look at the natural way first. Let's suppose you have identical twins where one has diabetes, the other one does not, or one has schizophrenia and the other one does not. Well, why is that? Those conditions have a partial genetic component, about 40-50%. So you can study those twins to try to figure out why one has the disease and why one doesn't. And that's information that can be used to assist the general population. Now, in the experimental form, what you do is suppose you want to figure out if a new method of teaching reading is beneficial. So you give that reading method to one twin and not to the other. And then after a while, you compare their reading skills. And if the reading skills are still matched, then you know that the reading training program had no effect. But if the one trained twin is better, then you know it probably did. Those methods have to be done very carefully, though, because it could be that behind the scenes, the trained twin is teaching the other twin, or the untrained twin learns something from his or her environment. So you have to control these things very carefully. Co-twin control studies are probably best for experimenting with medicines. For example, there was this theory that vitamin C prevented the common cold. The twin study showed that was not the case.
Okay, so a pretty clear-cut result from twin studies. So you give to half the twins effectively and not the other half, and you see how often they get common colds. No change.
Yeah.
No change, and no one can. Okay, and you've got very limited variability. In fact, you've got a paired design there because you can pair one Smith with the other Smith, one Jones with the other Jones, and so there's these identical pairs, and you find no difference. So that's as strong as you're going to get, perhaps, for an experimental design, well, a field-based experimental design. Mm. We can use such twin studies to get an idea, can we, about the relative influence of genes and of the environment on certain traits, anything really, from height to
And
personality types to whatever. So, and this would be based on adoption studies often?
sometimes. Now, let's talk about the kind of traits that you could study. I mean, as you say, you're correct that we can study virtually anything, any trait at all using twins. And what has really impressed me is how twin research has infiltrated fields that never really thought about twins before. For example, periodontics, gum disease. When I was at the University of Minnesota, we began to study twins in that laboratory. And the going wisdom had always been that periodontal disease was something environmental based on the host bacteria that you had in your mouth. But they're learning that it's the response to that host bacteria that makes the difference. So there is a genetic component to periodontal disease, which really shook that field apart. Also, twin studies have infiltrated people who work on work values, what you value on the job. People have looked at economics. Does education lead to greater wage earnings? I mean, there are so many ways that you can study twins. Political attitudes, religiosity, so many things way beyond the traditional ways of looking at intelligence and personality. But twin studies have complete freedom. You can use them to study anything.
Okay, that's amazing. So one might assume that twins reared together are going to be more similar for a certain trait than twins reared apart. Well, but it would depend on the trait.
Yes.
And so would it be fair to say the more genetically driven a trait, the less it's going to differ between twins that are reared apart, because the rearing apart generates environmental variation?
Yeah, that's generally the case. We find that for height and for brain waves, reared apart twins are about as similar as reared together twins. For identical twins raised together, their general intelligence level is slightly more alike than identical twins raised apart. And that makes sense because differences in education, things like quality of education, could make a difference. But it's not a huge difference. It's a correlation of 0.86 versus about 0.75. So it's not that different. But the most provocative finding that emerged, say, in the last maybe 30, 40 years was that in personality, identical twins raised apart are as similar as identical twins raised together. And that's a very counterintuitive finding because you think that people living together should be more alike, but they're not. So what that tells us is that for family members who live together, any behavioral similarities they have in terms of personality is due to their shared genes and not their shared environment. And a very nice way of looking at that too is children who I study called virtual twins. And virtual twins are same age, unrelated children raised together from birth. So they're very close in age. They're very twin-like, but they're not twins. But they're the same age. They go to school at the same time, same grade, all that sort of thing. And they're very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very different. Their intelligence levels are not as similar anywhere near as, and this is the key, fraternal twins raised together. Many people don't pay attention to that comparison, which I find so fascinating. Fraternal twins raised together versus unrelated same-age children raised together. Okay? And so if it's all common rearing, they should be the same, but they're not.
The fraternal twins are more similar than
Virtual twins. Yes.
virtual twins.
And I still need to look at the personalities of the virtual twins. I have studies of that now in progress.
Well, those results will be extremely interesting. It's possible, as you've already touched on, to quantify the gene effect versus the environmental effect, right, based on the degree of correlation. So for identical twins, in terms of, I think you said, intelligence, you've got something above 0.8, a correlation above 0.8 for identical twins reared together. It drops a little bit, but only down to a 0.7 something when they're reared apart. That in itself would suggest a very powerful, but not all powerful, genetic effect, and a subtle but important but much smaller environmental effect on IQ. Is that fair?
I think it's a fair thing to say, but I think it's also important to point out that in individual cases, uh, effects of environments can be extreme. And in fact, extreme environments can overwhelm individual differences. And I can give you a wonderful example of that. In 2010, I went down to Bogota, Colombia in South America, and I studied two sets of twins, identical males born a day apart. But the fascinating thing about them was that they were switched at birth. And this is all written up in my 2018 book, Accidental Brothers. What happened was that one pair of boys was born in Bogota, in a major hospital, and the other pair born 100 miles to the north in a very rural, kind of poorly equipped hospital. And one of those twins was very sick, so his grandmother brought him to the better hospital when he was a day old. And he stayed there a week, but there was a mix-up in the premature nursery, and the wrong baby was brought back to the north. And so they grew up as really virtual twins, but believing they were fraternal twins. And it was the same pair, actually, the same people, genetically speaking. And we found that both of the twins who were raised in Bogota, who had education, high school, college, they outperformed the twins in the rural area who didn't go beyond fifth grade. Now, I'm used to twins raised apart having similar levels of general intelligence, but this was a great example of how extreme environments can overwhelm individual differences.
Indeed. So you could have two seeds from the same plant. If you throw one onto the stony ground and one onto the fertile ground, if the stony ground is sufficiently stony, then you're going to get a very feeble plant, if at all, despite the two seeds perhaps being genetically identical. So if the environment is extreme, then yes, the environment can have a massive effect. Now that can be the case in the US, and as time has gone by, that's less and less likely. In other words, there are less and less people living in extreme poverty or levels of poverty, or getting very poor health access, at least when they're babies. So it's going to be less common to observe twins where one is in a very poor environment and such that environment is going to have a big effect.
Right.
That's less and less likely over time through modernity, I would hope, with a few ups and downs on the way. Whereas in a country like Colombia, perhaps with respect, there's a little more chance for that being the case.
Yeah. A really nice example, though, of twins who were raised apart, identical females who were raised apart in families where one family valued education, the other one didn't, shows how people select their own environments and create them. So this is actually a British pair. And one was raised in a family where education was valued. There were books in the house. The other one was not, but the other one loved to read. And so she got a library card and she kind of created her own education, if you will. So when the twins met and we brought them to Minnesota, they had very similar IQ scores and they both loved the same historical novels by the same author.
So that's a great example of, is it a good example of buffering by one of the children? So they weren't getting a great environment generated by the parents or the guardians, but they were able to generate to some degree their own environment by going to the library, for example.
Yes, but the library had to be there, see. Now, in the case of the Bogota twins, there was no library. And the one twin who should have been raised in Bogota, who was born there, was desperate for an education, just desperate. And while he tried to get one through the army, because he had to serve in the army there, they wouldn't allow it because he contracted some sort of a disease. So anyway, he finally, when they all met at the age of 25 through an amazing example of mistaken identity, he went and got his GED, his high school equivalency, and now he's a lawyer. He went to law school.
Wonderful. So he's in that.
Once he had the resources, he was able to take advantage of them.
Yeah, okay. I mean, now, if those resources come very late in the day, although that's a great story, it can come a bit too late for people to fulfill their potential, okay, because there's that crucial period when children are very young. But okay, so the better the environment, how should we put this? The better the environment, the less likely there is to be a strong environmental perturbation that is deleterious. And so as the environment kind of evens out almost, I suppose is that right? The genetic differences will tend to come to the fore, but they may not be very strong in identical twins for obvious reasons.
Yeah, the more the environment is even, the more genetic differences among people will be expressed. That's right.
Yes, okay. Now, before I'd like to move on in a moment to talk about some lovely anecdotes. You've touched on one or two already about identical twins being similar, but just before that, I wonder if it's suitable to list a few traits, human traits. It could be body traits, personality traits, cognitive traits that tend to be heavily genetically influenced typically, and the ones that tend to be more influenced by the environment. So reduce the correlation between twins when those twins are reared apart. So maybe to start with, which are the ones that seem to be relatively robust to environmental factors and therefore are relatively strongly genetically driven?
So I would say height, I would say brain waves. Those are really strongly genetically influenced.
Brain waves.
Brain waves, yeah. Um, I would then drop it down a bit to intelligence, which and those and the height and the brain waves are probably in the order of the 0.9s, right?
Right.
Then I would drop it down to intelligence about 0.75, personality and special abilities about 0.5, and then job satisfaction at about 0.3.
Or 0.3. Now, are twins going for the same jobs in the end, or are they getting different jobs and one of them's more satisfied?
Often similar jobs, not exactly the same job, but maybe both in artistic fields or both in more intellectual fields, things like that. But and when you think about job satisfaction, the one that has a slight genetic component is kind of an internal satisfaction. What makes you feel good about yourself, where you feel you have opportunities to advance. The one that does not show much genetic influence has to do more with external factors like work conditions or holidays or lunch hours, because everybody likes those. But it's the idea of whether you can advance, whether you feel fulfilled creatively and intellectually that shows the genetic effect, albeit small.
Very, very interesting. So I'd like to move from the sort of perhaps that's a little bit more quantitative to the qualitative, a little bit anecdotal, which I think is powerful. But you've worked with an awful lot of twins over the years. Have you found sometimes that twins have exhibited quirks that are remarkably similar that would seem to surely not be coincidental?
Absolutely. We think of these oddities or idiosyncrasies. Well, many people have thought of it as just sort of random, but I don't, because when you see them repeated in identical twins and almost never in fraternal twins, you have to believe something is going on there. And that tells us that our own little private rituals or oddities probably have a genetic component. Now, just some examples. We met these reared apart twin firemen. They didn't meet till they were 31 years old, and they both drank only Budweiser beer, and they always held the can. I'll show you here with the pinky finger underneath. Now, why is that? Well, you see, this is the beauty of identical twins because they give you new ways of thinking about behavior. So maybe they did it because their hand is made anatomically a certain way and it was more comfortable. Or maybe they felt more secure so they wouldn't spill the beer. So those are things we can start to investigate. We had a pair of identical twins who met at 25, and they both used Brill cream on their hair. Big deal. All the guys were using Brill cream then. But they both used a rare Swedish toothpaste called Vademecum. And no one has ever heard of Vademecum. I never heard of it until I met these twins. And it could be that they liked being different, or it could be that they liked the taste of it, or the fact that there was no fluoride in it. I mean, who knows? But at least it gives you a handle on why we choose the things that we do.
These are, as you say, the crucial thing is reared apart twins that nonetheless have these idiosyncrasies which, can't be coincidence.
Correct.
Nancy,
I've written a paper about this that appeared in the first issue of the Japanese Journal of Twin Studies. I believe that was January 21 or 22. And I review a lot of these kinds of things. And in all the twins I've studied, there was only one pair of reared apart fraternal twins who had this kind of idiosyncratic commonality, which was 18 tattoos on their bodies. We counted. Now, it would have been of interest, and we should have thought of it at the time, to see were those tattoos in common? Were they both flowers or serpents or something of that sort? But the fact that they both decorated their bodies to that degree was interesting. But it's only one case as opposed to the many with identical twins raised apart.
yes, indeed. I mean, they're intriguing, and one or two of them probably will in the end be coincidence, but there's too many for them to be coincidental, of course. No, that's and I can understand that when you see that as a researcher, although it's not proof of anything, it can really enlighten the mind and get one thinking about what can be studied and how to study and what we're learning from twins. Nancy, have you ever been present at a moment in time where two twins reared apart first met each other?
Yes, several
What
times.
happened? What happened?
Well, it's remarkable. I've been present and I've watched on videos as well. And you see variability from pair to pair. Sometimes it's just uncontrollable glee, and they're touching their face and the other person's face because they can hardly believe their eyes. It's absolutely the most amazing moment. And sometimes I find these films almost difficult to watch because it's like looking into a bright light. It's just too much emotion. But I've also seen meetings that are quieter, where twins just kind of look at each other and kind of hug quietly. But it's a reflection of their personalities, really. I often ask people to think, how would you feel if you were to meet your identical twin? And most people find it irresistible. A couple don't, but the vast majority do. And I think that that's not an unusual finding. It's to be expected because the idea of somebody with whom you share so much in common and who understands you and accepts you and is not judgmental is something we all crave. And identical twins have it effortlessly from the minute they're born.
Absolutely. Um, I'd like to go, if we can, a little bit darker, not too dark, but a little bit, because I'd like to talk first of all about the grieving of twins. So, um, people pass away inevitably. Twins won't necessarily pass at the same time. In fact, to some degree, of course, they almost certainly don't, unless, there's a joint incident such as an accident. So one twin almost inevitably will be left on their own for a while. And we know that in particular, identical twins have very strong bonds and can live very closely together emotionally and sometimes sort of geographically as well through their lives. So are there particular problems for twins when their twin sibling is lost?
Yes. And in fact, I have a study that now has over 800 twin survivors. And I'm interested in studying how grief in twins differs from the grief you feel for non-twin relatives, and also if there are differences between identical twins and fraternal twins. And for identical versus fraternal, I have fraternal same sex. I have found that identical twins grieve significantly higher, although it's a slight difference, but they do grieve more. And the fascinating thing about my sample is that it's all volunteer and it's 75% identical. Now, that makes no sense in the population. There should have been more fraternals, but I look at that as data because who comes forward? And I think the difference is not as big as I would have guessed because, or I would have expected, because the fraternal twins who do come forward are those that are not representative. They're the ones who are especially grieved. So that's why the difference is somewhat attenuated. But now you asked about how twin loss may be different from non-twin loss. With identical twins, and even to some degree with fraternals, the survivor is a constant reminder of the person who's been lost. And they're often going to be confused or called by the wrong name. So they're constant reminders. Birthdays now become days of mourning, whereas before they were celebrations. You've lost the close companion that you had, and you try to recreate it, but you inevitably cannot. And sometimes surviving twins find themselves taking on some of the habits or um, behaviors of the one who was lost. Now, I've often served as a expert witness in cases involving wrongful death, injury, and custody of twins. And in the wrongful death cases, the lawyers asked me to speak to what is lost. And I would say, again, it's the companionship, it's a source of revenue. Um, Also, when I think about my twin loss study, why identical twins may experience grief to a greater degree, if you think about it, when you lose your identical twin, you're losing a source of your genetic potential for future generations. Again, not consciously speaking, but any any child that your co-twin has is essentially your child genetically speaking, right? Yeah.
Indeed,
And
indeed.
so any child that your twin would have would increase or amplify your genetic potential for future generations. In this case, it's been lost.
Yes, yes. In fact, it always intrigued me that you could be a potentially a lazy twin who still had children because you could just wait for your twin to have children and you would be as related to those children as your twin is. Do you see what I mean?
Oh,
So
exactly. I mean, twin aunts and uncles become genetic mothers and fathers, and the children of identical twins are first cousins, but they're also genetic half siblings because they share a parent in common. And I can even tell you that I found a couple from Great Britain. I believe they were from the Isle of Wight, and it was identical twins who married identical twins. Now, that's happened before, and then the children are not just cousins, but they're full siblings, genetically speaking. But in this particular case, the moms delivered children on the same day, so they were essentially like fraternal twins.
oh wow. That's amazing. I have to sit and think that through, but I
Yeah,
take what you're
yeah,
saying. Wow.
yeah.
I suppose there's too few of these instances to be able to have interviewed the progeny to find out how they feel about
Well,
the unusual interrelatedness that they
that
have with each other.
that is a study that I've got on my back burner. I have a study on the social closeness between identical twins and their nieces and nephews, and fraternal twins and their nieces and nephews who are the ordinary conventional relatedness. But I've often wanted to do it the other way to ask the children about their relations with their parent and with their aunt or uncle. So that is something I definitely wish to do. It's a great design.
Do you have contacts with people in that position at the moment?
Yes, yes, I could start the study, but I'll tell you, Lewis, I'm on academic leave this year, so I'm not sure I will, but maybe next year. Be a great student project.
Oh yes, it would be absolutely wonderful. And the Isle of Wight's very nice as well if you happen to work with those with those individuals. Very nice place to visit. Um, let, let, Now we talked about twin studies and the value of twin studies in terms of twins versus twins reared apart and so forth. And it's super cool, but there's a darker side, isn't there, to some of the data associated with some of those studies. And actually, you've written about this in deliberately divided. Could you talk a little bit about what's happened there behind the scenes in the past?
Yep. Well, Deliberately Divided is a book that I published in 2021, and the subtitle is Inside the Controversial Study of Twins and Triplets Adopted Apart. And this was a horrific experiment that was done. There was a psychiatric consultant, Louise, from the Louise Wise Adoption Agency. Her name was Viola Bernard. And she had some kind of a misguided idea that twins and triplets were better off being raised by different families to avoid parental overburdening and to let twins develop their own identities. She worked with Peter Neubauer. This is all in the 1960s. And Dr. Peter Neubauer was the head of the Child Development Center in the Jewish Board of Guardians. And so they collaborated, and so they studied 4 or 5 sets of identical separated twins and the identical triplets. They also separated several sets of fraternal twins, but did not study them. Now, when the children were given to the different families, even if parents asked for twins, because these were desperate people who wanted to have children, they were told that twins weren't available, and they were given one child and not told the child was a twin. So researchers would come to the home every couple of months in the beginning, and then maybe once or twice a year after that till the kids turned 12, and gather all these data. And then what broke this whole thing open was in 1980 when the identical triplets met by chance, because they were all in the New York City area. And that brought out what exactly was going on. And then some of these other twins met by chance along the way, but didn't get the attention they deserved. In 2018, there was a film called Three Identical Strangers that came out that was directed by a British director, Tim Wardle. And that was also came out about the same time as a film called The Twinning Reaction, done here in the US by Laura Shinseki. And Lori said to me, she has all these data she gathered while working on the film. I should write a book. And, honestly, Lewis, I was a little bit on the fence about it in the beginning because I knew it would be controversial. I knew there'd be people, colleagues of the late investigators who wouldn't want to talk to me. But I decided it was an important episode in twin research and I needed to document it. And so I ended up writing this amazing book. It's a great read if you ask me, but it goes into all the details of that study, all the lives of the twins. I found every set of identical twins who had been studied. And then the important messages for today that this was a great example of how not to do research.
Absolutely. Now, I'd like to say this one step darker because I think it's important to look at these issues. So you've also written about, now I've got the title here, The Twin Children of the Holocaust. So this is, it's Auschwitz towards the end of the Second World War. The extremely infamous Dr. Mengele was there and was performing experiments, obviously non-voluntary experiments, on some of the prisoners at Auschwitz, and unfortunately had a particular penchant for twins. Are you able to talk a little bit about what went on at that time? And we know a bit about what went on, well, obviously through your work, but via survivors, remarkably, of that particular concentration camp. And at that time, that they would have been children at the time, I understand.
Yeah. So the book is The Twin Children of the Holocaust with the subtitle Stolen Childhood and the Will to Survive. So let me tell you how I got involved with this. Also, I'm a Jewish twin, so I felt a certain kinship with those people and knew that another time, another place, my sister and I might have been on that railroad ramp and selected to find our way to the twins' barracks. Now, in 1984, I was in California. I heard a late night radio program that talked about this gathering of twins in Poland at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp to commemorate the 40th anniversary of their liberation by Soviet troops. And it was to be followed by a 3-day public hearing on Mengele's war crimes to be held at Yad Vashem, which is the Memorial Institute for the Holocaust in Jerusalem. And I knew, Lewis, instantly I was going. I just knew I was going. And I went, I was able to raise funds. And so while I was there at both of these events and at some related events subsequently, I took hundreds and hundreds of photographs. And no one really saw them. They're unique photographs, not shown anywhere else in the world. And during COVID, while I was finishing up Deliberately Divided, I saw this stash of photos in my closet and decided I've got to publish these. And I published a slim volume, we've given the title already, and it's an annotated photo collection. And I provide enough text to provide context, but the photos pretty much speak for themselves. There are 110 photographs in there of these Holocaust twins, and their stories are told. It's a beautiful production by Academic Studies Press. They used lovely paper, so the quality is really quite good. But I felt it was important to get this out because it's a document of a horrific time in human history. And it's also information because while these twins were children at the time, what happens is that they're a lot older now. And unless we document their stories, we're going to start losing this information because some of them are passing away. So I believe it is a contribution, and I'm very gratified that I did it. And in fact, since it's come out, I've been able to be in touch with some of the twins from Israel that I had lost touch with, and that's been enormously gratifying. And in fact, I would love to get to Israel if I could and meet up with some of them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I do recommend people delve into that. It's such an important story that it's very, very important. It's been documented. And as you say, whilst there are still enough people around to be able to provide their experiences of that extraordinarily terrible period in our history. Well, okay, let's finish now on a lighter note. So we've talked about twins, how they can be quite similar or very similar in some situations, how sometimes environmental differences or environmental perturbations don't have a large effect, how sometimes they can have a large effect. And a big part of a child's environment, obviously, is the one that's created for them by their parents or their guardians, as we've touched on, both physically, emotionally, what's available to them, where they go, how they're treated. What do twin studies teach us about good parenting, how to parent well?
I think what twin studies teach us about how to parent well probably comes more from fraternal twins than identicals because fraternal twins are different. And if parents learn to adjust their treatment of each child that is aligned with that child's interests and abilities and even foibles, I think that that is the big lesson. And, quite honestly, I think that parents of fraternal twins are better researchers or better appraisers of human behavior than many of my colleagues who really still focus on environment. In other words, they'll say, you read to your child, the child's a good reader. Well, you have to think about this much more in a detailed fashion. Parents who may read to their children a lot may be brighter parents, but they also have brighter children who request reading. Just reading to a child who's not interested may not accomplish much. I'm not saying that you don't do that. You try your best to interest the child in as much, but you have to find creative ways perhaps of getting the child engaged. So I think that's an important lesson that twins can teach parents about how to manage children.
Yes, I agree. And you'll know Professor Robert Plomin uh, in the UK here at
He
King's
was my
College.
he was my partner at the debate in New York City on parenting is overrated.
Oh, I see. There we. Oh, okay. Oh, parenting is overrated.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Um, I think I'd be right in saying that yes, he would argue that of course parents are important, obviously, but they can overrate their importance, that they are driving the environment of those children less than they realize. It's more driven by the children than we realize. So, for example, if you give a child a doll, doesn't matter if it's boy or girl, but you give the child a doll, if they don't play with it, you don't get them another doll. If they do play with it, then you might get them another one or get them more clothes for the doll. You kind of roll with it. Again, with books, yes, if they're interested in books or interested in reading, as soon as they find a book, and there's bound to be one somewhere, then they're more likely to start looking at it. And then the parents will tend to track that and get them books.
Right.
Whereas if you're buying a child books repeatedly or getting them access to books and they're not so interested, then you tend to move on to other things. So I think it's more child driven than people realize. However, I can imagine now people screaming in my ear, Nancy, and saying, "Well, okay, but of course there's a massive effect of parenting on children. What about children who grow up mentally disadvantaged because they've been abused, for example? We can't possibly say that parenting is overrated."
Well, when it comes to abuse, we're talking about extreme environments. When I talk about children, or we both talk about children driving parental treatment, we're talking about the enormous range of normal environments in which children are loved, nurtured, protected. But if you're talking about abuse, of course, that can override genetic potential. That's a totally different topic.
Yes, the point being that in extremis, yes, environment can be very, very important, and that's really important to recognise. But in a more reasonable, run-of-the-mill, regular, modal, typical environment, uh, parents are important, but less important than they think they are for the development of the child.
Well, I don't want to tell parents they're less important than they think they are because I think parenting is important and I want parents to believe they are. And I'm not just saying that, I think they are. But I think their job, as we said earlier, is to be sensitive to these children and do everything they can to promote the child's abilities and talents and interests, help the child get over any difficulties. That's where good parenting, I think, is important. And that's the crucial responsibility. And I don't think it's so easy. I want to just turn, if I could, briefly to my newest book, because I think this illustrates some of these concepts. It's called Gay Fathers, Twin Sons, The Citizenship Case That Captured the World. It came out just last month. And the reason I bring it up is that it's two gay fathers, and they had twin sons with an egg donor and a surrogate born in Canada. And what happened was they took the top two embryos, and one was created by the egg donor with the sperm from one man and one sperm from the other. So the children were like genetic half siblings, right? Because they shared the mother's genes but not the father's. And the difficulty came when after the children were born in Canada and the parents wanted to relocate to the US, because one parent was a US citizen and one was an Israeli citizen, there were difficulties there and they were treated poorly. And the upshot was that one child was given US citizenship and the other one a tourist visa. You just don't treat twins that differently. But the point I want to make about all this is that these parents, who are wonderful parents, I've interviewed them many times, I've observed them with their kids, they really point out the differences in their two boys. You know, they can see them and they nurture them and they give them what the children want. I mean, they're very sensitive parents, and it's just been beautiful for me to see that.
Absolutely, no, absolutely, and so you would be very much an advocate for it doesn't matter the sex of the two parents or guardians. That's not there's not going to be a systematic influence on children if they have parents of two sexes or one sex.
You know, the best thing we can do for children is to nurture them, love them, and protect them and keep them safe. And there is evidence from studies more on gay women than gay fathers, just because that was more common in the past, I believe. But and more women were likely to have families. But the point is that the children come out just fine. They tend to be more tolerant, in fact, and they don't have any more problems at school or educational difficulties. They're just ordinary children. And I know that there are people out there who do not approve of gay marriage, and no, fine, you don't have to. But I think you've got to let people live their own lives. And I've never, as I point out in my book, I've never seen a group of gay couples marching to take away the rights of heterosexual couples, only the other way around. And I'm telling you, if you see this couple with their children, all you see are two parents who love their children. That's all. You see nothing else. And in fact, one of the fathers said to me, you know, we're so boring. All we do is take our kids to Disneyland, we watch Netflix, we go to Walmart. He said, the only thing different is that we happen to be two fathers. But he said, other than that, we're just boring people. And you know what? People should pay attention. I would love to produce a documentary on that. I'm working with somebody, a wonderful director. We're now scattering around for funds for this documentary. I think it would absolutely make a fantastic story given the parenting aspect and the fact that the citizenship was largely in question. That's a whole story in itself, the crazy lawsuit that they had to go through against the US State Department and Secretary of State.
Hear to all you say about the parenting, about it ultimately just matters on loving the child, children, responding to them, caring for them, looking after them, looking after their needs and so forth. And I'm not the expert, but it doesn't surprise me at all to hear that nothing else really matters. And I think as a world, we're getting more used to that slowly but surely. Some countries more than others, but the more you just see it in action and you just see it's a loving relationship, you know, I think that that will assuage most people's fears in the end, or concerns, shall we say, and that's a good thing. So excellent, excellent. Well, let's finish it on that note. Although, gosh, you know, I could chat to you all day, and it is all day for you because your day's just starting, isn't it? I could chat to you all night from my point of view on this topic. I hope we can do again at some point in the future. Maybe if you're back in London, you can look me up. I'm not too far away. But Nancy, thank you very much. Now, you've cited several wonderful books that you've written. I know there are many more, and some of the papers that you've published. I can put those in the notes associated with this video for the ease for people. But is there a web page where people can go to find your publications?
Yes, there is a web page, and I'll say it slowly twice. It's drnancysegaltwins.org, and it's all lowercase, Dr. Nancy Segal twins.org. Yeah, and if people want to email me, that my email address is on there, and I will say that I answer every email I get.
Wow, that's it, because you must get a lot, Nancy. I think you must get a lot.
But some of them are fascinating, and some of them have led to great opportunities and connections. So I listen to everyone.
Wonderful. Nancy, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Louis.